Continue in Rabbi Pesachim in the practical halachas of Shinamaka and Yaye and the halachas of Kiddush, changing a place and to when you can eat at a meal. So we ended yesterday with we had seen a machlokes in the Kiddush that's made in shul, which was, the Gemara had explained, was a custom because people had there was guests that would sometimes eat in the shul, so they made Kiddush there for them. And the question, and then therefore they made it every week in case there was a guest or someone that needed Kiddush. And Rav said that you'd fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush, whoever made the Kiddush here, fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush in shul, and that the obligation of making the bracha on wine, Bar Pri Hagafen, would be required again at home because there's a shinui makom, there's a change of place that sort of ends the previous eating session and begins a new one when you get home. Shmuel says not only do you have to make a Bar Pri Hagafen again, but you have to make Kiddush as well, because Ein Kiddush El B'Makom Sudi, you require the place of the meal in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush. And Rabbi Yochanan suggested that even Bar Pri Hagafen, you don't have to make the new bracha, repeat the bracha, because this doesn't count as a break in the eating session, the shinu makom, changing from one place to another. And we saw the statement of Rav Chisda that, we saw a statement of Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said in the name of Rav Huna that shinu makom, this that we say that you go from one place to another, is dependent upon mibayis lebayis. If you go from either one house to another, or one room to another, very unclear in halacha how much of a change it constitutes a change. But aval mimakim l'makim, but within one space, whether within one house or within one room, then the halacha would be you do not need a new bracha. Rav Chisda also said, in his own opinion, that the halacha of tu'unim bracha achreya, certain foods that you eat constitute a more settled meal, if you would, a more established eating session, and therefore the after bracha you have to go back for and say the bracha in its place where you ate, and so therefore you would require going back anyhow. And since you have to go back to make the after bracha, that means the eating session is not over, and so you can eat even in a new place without making a bracha. Before we get to the conclusion and what would be included in that, so the concept is when you say an after bracha, that's generalized. It's not specified to the food, like bar nefashos. So therefore, the after bracha it can be said anywhere. It doesn't require that you go back and say it in its place, and therefore, leaving would be a conclusion of your eating session. However, if you have to go back for the after bracha, that would constitute that an established eating session, and that's why you have to go back and make the bracha there. And those are the after brachas that are specified to the category of food that you're eating, and therefore your eating session is not over. And even if you left and went somewhere else, you don't have to say a bracha after the meal you ate, and you don't have to make a new bracha for what you're eating in the new place. Rav Sheshes disagreed. Rav Sheshes says either one requires a bracha. Now, we saw a brisa that seems to indicate contrary to Rav Chisda and like Rav Sheshes, because the brisa said that if there were a group of people that sat together for a it just says masubin lishtes. They were sitting around. They were leaning to drink, which is an established drinking session. Now, what type of drinking? It must be wine. And the reason it must be wine is because it says va'akru ragleim, and they uprooted their feet. The uprooting indicates to the Gemara that that's talking about something that requires a bracha in its place, meaning that it kept you, that you are set, you're sort of locked in, and when you get up to leave, you are uprooting something. So you're uprooting yourself. That means that there's tu'unim bracha la'acharei. It required a bracha afterwards in its place. And yet it says that only if they left someone behind and when they left, do they not have to make a bracha achrona, because they kept the drinking session alive by leaving someone there. And so when they went out to greet the bride and groom, and when they come back, they will when they come back, they will not have to make a new bracha. However, if everybody left, then they would have to make a new bracha, even though that akur ragleim means that they were in an established drinking session, which of wine, which would require a bracha in its place, and yet they have to make a new bracha, which is a contradiction to Rav Chisda, who said that if the after bracha of the session, the drinking session that you just had, if the after bracha is required in its place, means you are set and established. Your leaving does not uproot or end the eating session, and you don't need bracha as you start. So therefore, we left it that this seems to be a contradiction to Rav Chisda, and the Gemara is now going to give an answer. And this is at the bottom of Kuf Aleph Amid Base 101 B, right as we go to Kuf Base Amid Aleph. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says this is not a contradiction to Rav Chisda, because actually there's a clear brisa like Rav Chisda which mentions a machlokas about it. Mantana Kiras Rabbi Yehuda. Perhaps this brisa that says that when you uproot, you have to make a new bracha, that's the opinion of Rabbi Kiva, the Tanya, as we learned. Chaverim she'im mesubim v'akur ragleim. A group of people that were sitting together, leaning and eating or drinking, v'akur ragleim, and they uprooted their feet, meaning they ended by getting up and going elsewhere. The whether it was to go to shul or to go to learn, when they leave, they don't have to make a bracha for the session, for the eating that they just did. They also don't have to make a new bracha when they come back. As long as they intended to continue eating, it doesn't make a difference. So a group of people sitting down, they're having lunch, they're having dinner, whatever it may be, and they realize, it's time for davening in shul. So they get up and say, we'll be back. They go, they daven, they come back. They don't have to make a new bracha because they intended to come back. They intended to continue eating. And the going out for davening is a break of a meal that requires the bracha in its place. If it requires a bracha in its place, you don't have to make a new bracha. And we know that it requires a bracha in its place because it says akru ragleim, they uprooted their feet, meaning they were locked there right now. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. However, Rabbi Yehuda says that's not so simple. That's only true if they left some of their friends there. But if they did not leave any friends there, Rabbi Yehuda says the requirement to be exempt of the new brachas is that you leave someone at the meal, that you have someone there and someone has remained there in their place, because then you haven't ended the meal because you intend to come back to it, and there are some people still there. But if no people if everybody's leaving, then you would have to have a bracha before you leave and a new bracha when you come back. So we already see we are 102. We are 102A. So we see in this brisa that there is such an opinion, Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, who says that you need to leave somebody behind, and that would explain the previous brisa that said that when they came out, they heard the bride or the groom walking by, and they went out to greet him. They left somebody behind, usually the person that couldn't go out, which was either somebody that was ill or elderly. In any case, that brisa that required that person remaining is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rav Chisda follows the majority that says that you do not require that. So Gemara says all the time that the reason is that it's specific to foods that require a bracha after them in their place, meaning a food that locks you in place, that is an established meal, an established session while you're sitting there. But food or drink that does not require that you have the after bracha in its place. Then when you leave, you have to have a bracha, and when you come back, you have to have a new bracha on anything that you're going to eat or drink. So, let's say this is a contradiction. This brisa is in a contradiction to Rabbi Yochanan, who had said that the person who made kiddush at shul, not only did he fulfill his obligation to kiddush, but he also fulfilled the obligation of bar pri hagafen and would not have to make a bracha at home. So Gemara says, is this really a contradiction to that as well? Did we not already contradict Rabbi Yochanan's statement and negate it on account of the contradiction from a brisa before? Let's say this is also a contradiction, and the reason for that would be is in case somebody found that the previous brisa's text that was a contradiction is flawed, or if somebody found that a different explanation to that brisa, and which would sort of defend Rabbi Yochanan. Let's say we have another brisa that's a contradiction. Rabbi Yochanan said, actually, this brisa, even though the simple reading would be a contradiction, we could explain it, and even according to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan could say, perhaps, even if it does not require a bracha in its place, an after bracha, meaning that it's a type of food that doesn't have a specified after bracha, and you can make the after bracha anywhere you go. Nevertheless, you would still be exempt of making the after bracha and a new bracha when you start eating or drinking again. And so, if so, why did the brisa specifically talk about a case of akru ragleim, where they had established their eating or drinking session, and then they have to uproot it, meaning that it's a type of food or drink that requires a bracha in its place? To tell you the strength of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you have to make a bracha afterwards and a new bracha when you come back, even if it's something that is an established meal. You washed for food, for bread, and it was a bread meal, and you have to come back and say the bracha achrona, you have to bench. Nevertheless, it counts as you move, you go to a different place, that constitutes a change. And that is the chiddush. So we wanted to tell you that Rabbi Yehuda is so strict that even if it's an established meal, he says you have to make a new bracha when you leave and come back. But the opposing opinion doesn't only require it in a bread meal or any meal that requires the after bracha in its place, tu'una bracha lacharein, but even ein tu'una bracha lacharein, even if you do not require a bracha in its place, still they say that the majority opinion would say, the chachamim, they would say that you don't have to make a bracha when you leave and come back. Because Rabbi Yehuda says only if you left people there. But if you didn't leave any friends, when you leave, you have to make a bracha for the previous food. You need a new food, a new bracha for the new food. So this brisa is not necessarily a contradiction to Rabbi Yochanan, because he could say that even though it does speak specifically about foods that require a bracha in its place, it may be only to tell you the strength of Rabbi Yehuda's stringency, but not the limits to the Chachamim's leniency. And that's why it's not necessarily a contradiction. John, what was your question?
So I feel like what we're saying is that the meal takes on a life of its own. It becomes like if people can leave and come back, I don't have anybody that's quote unquote hosting, right? So if some people leave and then come back, and then other people leave and then come back, you could potentially have a situation where there's nobody that's been there from start to finish, yet the meal continues to exist as its own thing.
I'll take it one step further. It could be that no one's there for a 20-minute period. No one, period. And still the meal continues because the intent was to come back, and they went out for a specific reason. They went out for something, right? So we're not ending the meal. We're continuing. We're just going down there for a minute, and then we'll be right back.
But I thought you said somebody has to be left behind.
According to Rabbi Yehuda.
Okay.
Rabbi Yehuda says somebody has to be left behind. The majority opinion, the Chachamim said, well, even if nobody's left behind, as long as it's a type of food that you're eating that requires a bracha in its place, so you're bound to come back, and if you intend to continue eating, and you're bound to come back, so then that doesn't require a new bracha because the meal did not end with your leaving the room.
So how would you handle then one of these progressive dinners where you start at one house and you go to another house and another house and another house, and then you come back to the place you started?
Yeah. So that is actually better because there from the start you intended to eat in these multiple places. So when you started the meal, you intended to end the meal or move the meal from one place to another, then for sure that you don't need a new bracha because the initial meal was set in such a manner. So that actually is even better because there you intended to start here and go to the next house and then go to the next place and then go to the next place and then come back. That actually was the initial intent of the meal. So then for sure the initial bracha maintains itself as you move along the progression because that was the intent of the bracha. Our Mishnah, our halachas here, our Brisa said, Rav Chisda, we're talking about where initially I sat down to eat at my home and then said, you know what, I got to go to mincha. And so everybody picks up and goes to mincha. And then when we come back, we continue the meal since it wasn't a long, and the initial intent was not the initial intent. The intent when I left was to continue eating. So I didn't intend my leaving to be a secession of this meal. So then I could come back and continue eating. And that's the chiddush of this idea. It was good, John, that even after a year, you still remember these ideas of eating in other people's houses. It's a fascinating thing. You have a very good memory. I forgot that once existed.
Coffee is what it's all about.
Tanya Kavaseder Rav Chisda. So the Brisa says we have a Brisa that concurs with Rav Chisda. And Rashi, Tosfos, and others say, even though that really the previous Brisa also could be in a certain way proof to Rav Chisda, we have a Brisa that's very clear, explicit, nothing else to it, of Rav Chisda. Chaverim shoyim mesubim l'shtis yayin. Group of people sitting together to drink wine, or maybe this text doesn't say to drink wine according to Tosfos. In any case, a group of people sitting together with the intent of establishing a eating or drinking session. They left and they came back, and it says they uprooted themselves, meaning that they were rooted there. They had a bracha that they have to come back for. Period. They do not have to make a new bracha. So this clearly like Rav Chisda. So we had essentially a progression of ideas of shinui makom, of changing place. We have Rav Chisda, who says, yeah, you made a bracha one place, you go to another place, it doesn't require a new bracha. You made a bracha as long as your intent was to continue eating. The fact that you moved from one place to another does not, by default, create a lack of intention or a change of eating session and therefore requiring a new bracha. Rav Huna says, but there's a caveat. That's only if your change is not within a defined space. But if it's within the defined space, not a problem. And we'll try and touch on what is that defined space. Rav Chisda, based on the Brisa, the Brisas we have, says, well, another leniency, if you would. Any time that you are required to come back for the after bracha, that would be enough of a lock in your meal that it continues, because you haven't, the change of place doesn't make a difference because you have to come back for the after bracha. So that continues the meal alive, to keep the meal alive, and your intent is to continue eating. So you don't have to make an after bracha now, and you don't have to make a new bracha when you begin again. Rabbi Yehuda says that, well, you actually have to leave someone there in order for that to count. Only if you left someone in place. But if you didn't leave somebody there, that session ended and you have to make a bracha. So we need two things that need a definition. One, what is the definition of if you went out of your house or out of your place? That's when you require a new bracha. But within the same place, then you does not require a new bracha. So our text of the Gemara says, "Elami bayis lebayis." Only if you left from house to house. Avami makom lemakom, but from one place to another, look, it does not require a bracha. Now, what is this mimakom lemakom, from one place to another place, that would not require a new bracha? So Rashi on this page at the top says mibayis la'aliyah, from one floor to the next. So if you leave to another story in the house, you leave to another floor, that would constitute a change. Whereas others have the text over here, mipina lapina, from one corner to another corner. That doesn't require a bracha. That means you're within the same room. Yesterday I gave the example. You're at in an auditorium, you're at a wedding, and you go from your table, 10 tables away to somebody else's table to say hi and to greet them. That's where you wouldn't need a new bracha. But if you left the room, that would require a new bracha. The custom, even though the halacha may be like this latter opinion, the custom is like the first opinion, that if you move from one room to another room within a house, one room to another room within a space, that does not require a new bracha. The halacha is also, if anything requires an after bracha, you does not need a new bracha. What are those things? That we said anything that has a specified after bracha. So that's anything that, any fruit that are of the blessed fruits of Eretz Yisrael, which would be grape, fig, olive, date, pomegranate, and also the grains, the 5 grains, which are wheat, spelt, barley, oat, and rye. So if you have any foods made of those, you have to have an after bracha in its place, and therefore you would that session would continue even if you left, because you have to come back for the after bracha. Now, even though the halacha is, it's not our place here, but even though the halacha is, if you left and have a difficulty coming back, you can't really go back, that you make the bracha where you are. But since the bracha, the halacha is l'chatchila, that when you can, you should go back to say the after bracha. That locks in the session that when you left, you went to mincha, you went out to greet a bride and groom, even if no one would remain behind in the place, you can come back and continue the meal without any new bracha. That sort of concludes this discussion of shinui makom, of a change in place, and the requirements for making a new bracha. Tana Rabban. The Brisa taught. We have a Brisa that sort of brings us back to the original conversation that we had, which was that you had a meal and now you have to make kiddush because Shabbos and Yom Tov came. and now you have to break. So Rabbi Yehuda had said, you have to break. Shabbos Yom comes. You cannot continue eating. You have to accept Shabbos. You have to bring in Shabbos. So you're going to say Kiddush, which is going to end the previous meal. As we see with Rabbi Yehuda, that really any break, you left, that changes the meal, even though you intend to continue eating. Here too, also Rabbi Yehuda says you have to say Kiddush. That ends the eating session. So you have to say the after bracha, and you have to say a new bracha for the new meal for Kiddush. So that ends and breaks the meal. And Rabbi Yossi said, no, you can continue eating all the way to the end, and you'll say Kiddush after the meal. And we saw the opinion that Shmuel said it's either an explanation of Rabbi Yossi, or a third opinion that you would be paras mapa. You just cover the meal, make believe it's not there, say Kiddush, and then restart your meal, and you don't need new brachas for that. So this brisa taught, Tana Rabbanan, B'nei Chabur Roshei Mesubin, a group of people sitting and having a meal. V'kiddush aleim hayom, and Shabbos came in. The day became sanctified for them, meaning that Shabbos or Yontif came in, and now they have to, they have to say Kiddush. So they're bring him a cup of wine. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he must end the previous eating session and start a new one. Now, the halacha is, as we'll see, the main requirement is that when you say benching, to say benching on a cup of wine. Exactly what the requirements for that are, even by yourself, even only with 3, so that you have a zimun, with 10, whatever that it is. But there is this idea that when you bench, you have to have a bracha ala kos. You have to have a cup of wine that you're saying the bracha on. So this person now has potentially 2 cups of wine that he needs to have and 2 obligations. He has to bench on the previous meal, and he has to eat, and he has to say Kiddush for the continuation of the meal, which is not a continuation according to Rabbi Yehuda. It's a new Shabbos meal. V'ayma love Kiddush said to bring him. So our text says they bring in a cup of wine. He's going to say Kiddush. V'asheni ayma love berachas hamazon, and the second one he's going to say benching for the previous meal, different Rabbi Yehuda. And the explanation for this order would be that once you're obligated in Kiddush, you're not allowed to eat. So you can't say a benching on a cup of wine because you can't drink that cup of wine yet. You didn't say Kiddush. So first you have to say Kiddush. Then you have to bench on the previous meal. And even though that Kiddush would have to be a part of the meal and you're taking a break, so either Rabbi Yehuda is not of that opinion, or since we follow the halacha is that you do need Kiddush in the place of the meal. Anything that's necessary for the meal won't constitute a break between Kiddush and the meal, and then perhaps Rabbi Yehuda would hold that this doesn't constitute as a break. In any case, so this text says that you the first cup you say Kiddush, that allows you to eat and drink. The second cup you say benching on the previous meal, and then you drink the cup of the bracha of benching. However, Tosfos and others have a text that the first cup you say Kiddush, you say benching, and you conclude the previous meal, and you have a cup of wine for that. And even though that you're not supposed to eat, this is still a part of the necessity of getting to Kiddush. And then the second cup you make Kiddush. But either way, Rabbi Yehuda requires 2 cups of wine, 1 for Kiddush, 1 for the benching of the previous meal, and then you start a new meal. However, as we've seen before, Rabbi Yossi, you can continue eating into the night, and when you're done, and now we turn to Beis Amud Beis. When you're done, Gamru, when you conclude the meal, whenever it is, then you're going to say benching for the meal that you had. And as Tosfos points out, the Gemara is going to say that you add the ritzei, you add the inclusion for Shabbos in this meal, or for Yontiv in the meal, because part of the meal happened on Shabbos, and it retroactively works as a meal for Shabbos. So you're going to say the ritzei in there. So the first cup you say benching on the meal, and the second cup, Vasheni, I'm all of Kiddush, and then you say Kiddush. And even though, and Tosfos points out, even though that we said you need Kiddush b'makam sudi, you need the Kiddush at the place of the meal. It is at the place of the meal. It doesn't have to be prior to the meal. It has to be at the place of the meal. And so as long as you're still in your meal session, meaning that you're sitting right there, you say Kiddush, and that works on the meal. So the Gemara now asks this on this brisa that continues the conversation that we started with, which was that whether you are allowed to continue the meal into the night or you have to break the meal. And both of them said you're going to need 2 cups of wine, one for Kiddush, one for Havdalah. One for Kiddush, one for benching. Amai. Why do you need two separate Kiddushes, 2 separate cups? Why don't you just say both on 1 cup of wine? Take a cup of wine, fill it up, say benching on it. When you finish benching, say Kiddush on it, and drink it. Why do you have to split it into 2? Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Sheshes. Rav Huna said in the name of Rav Sheshes, and this is unique because they are essentially contemporaries, and Rav Sheshes maybe Rav Huna maybe being the leader, but he's quoting Rav Sheshes. So Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Sheshes, Ein oimrim shtei kiddush al kais echad. You don't say 2 kedushas on 1 cup. My time. What's the reason? Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lefi she'ein osim mitzvahs chavilas. As a general rule, we don't do mitzvahs in bundles because it looks like I'm just trying to get it out of the way. This is a burden, and so I'm just going to get these mitzvahs out of the way, and you do bundling of the mitzvahs. You don't do that. You do one mitzvah, give it its proper time, and do another mitzvah, give it its proper time. The halacha is that you can do a lot of mitzvahs under one bracha. For instance, if somebody's putting up mezuzahs on their house, you say one bracha and you put up all the mezuzahs in the house. So that's not a mitzvahs chavilas because it's one mitzvah, so you're not making them in bundles. However, when there are 2 separate obligations, one house and then another, that may be a separate obligation. We have the same thing with when there's a bris for twins or for 2 different babies, but on the same morning, and they're in the same shul. Even though that technically the moel can say one bracha and it'll cover both brises, we don't do that because that's going to look like mitzvahs chavilas. You're doing mitzvahs in bundles. So rather we do one bris and do all the brachas and mitzvahs, and then you take a walk, even if it's the same set of parents, meaning that it's twins. So the moel and the parents, the father would go for a walk and leave the place to take a break. So this becomes a new obligation because the idea is that when we do mitzvahs, you don't want to bundle them, one bracha for all of it, one bracha for different mitzvahs. So over here, it's different mitzvahs, we don't want to do it. However, as I said, if it's the same mitzvah, like you're putting up a bunch of mezuzahs, that's not bundling, that's really the same mitzvah. And so that's that there you say one bracha for all of it. Now the Gemara is going to challenge based on something that happens often on Yontif, that when Yontif comes right after Shabbos, we say Havdalah in Kiddush. We say Havdalah for Shabbos and Kiddush for Yontif. And that's going to be this year when we have Pesach, the Seder begins right after Shabbos. So we're going to wait for after Shabbos, and then we're going to say in Kiddush, we're going to say Havdalah. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, when he comes home, Motzei Shabbos, Mavarech al Yayin, he says Bora Priya Gafen, Val HaMa'or, and he says a bracha on the candle, Val HaBesamim, and a bracha on the incense. We have the order the other way around. And then he says Havdalah on the cup of wine. Now, if he only has 1 cup of wine, so then he's going to wait until he finishes his Malava Malka, his meal after Shabbos that escorts Shabbos, which is called Malava Malka, escorting the queen. The Malava Malka meal, he has to bench, and on that benching, he's going to need a cup of wine. So everybody only has 1 cup of wine. So he says Havdalah, and he's going to wait until he can say the bracha on wine for the meal. Umishalshal kula lacharov. And he's going to say all the brachas, both havdalah and benching on the 1 cup of wine. So Gemara says, yeah, of course. There you're telling me the reason within the text itself. The Brisa says because he doesn't have any other wine. He only has 1 cup. So what's he supposed to do? Ein le shani. Of course, if you only have one, what are you going to do? You have 2 obligations and all you have is 1 cup of wine. So you're going to save them to do it together. But in general, if you have more than 1 cup of wine, then you're going to do them separately. So Gemara says, wait, but what about this year on Pesach? Yantav that comes immediately after Shabbos, the Isle. He's going to have more cups of wine, right? He has 4 cups. He has wine for multiple cups of the Seder. So he has the availability, and yet he says Kiddush and Havdalah on 1. V'amar Rav, and Rav says, Yayin Kiddush Ner Havdalah, Yakna. He's going to say Yayin. He's going to say Bar Priagafen, Kiddush. Then he's going to say Ner Barei Ma'arei Aish, and the candle, and then the bracha on Havdalah. So why over there does he bundle it? Gemara says Amri Midlei Amazman. Well, actually, he didn't say Shehechiyanu, so he doesn't have the Shehechiyanu in there. Mechlal de b'shvius Pesach haskira. Must be that it's the last days of Pesach, because that's the only time you don't say Shehechiyanu. The first days of Sukkot you say Shehechiyanu. By Shmini Atzeres, because it counts as its own Chag, you say Shehechiyanu. By Shavuos, you say Shehechiyanu. The first days of Pesach, you say Shehechiyanu. When do you have a Yantiv that's going to come after Shabbos that you don't say Shehechiyanu? It's only in the last days of Pesach. Well, then maybe he's out of wine already. I mean, it's been a full Yantiv with 2 Seders and Chol HaMoed. He doesn't have any wine left. This is his last glass of wine. The Chol Mai de Havale, whatever he had, he was already consumed. And he doesn't have any more, and that's why he says we said you say a new bracha. You say them both on 1 bracha. The Gemara says, is that really so? Yantav Risha de Isle, even on the first days of Yantav, when he does have 2 cups, he still is going to say all of it on 1 cup. And what's the reason? And how do we know that? Abaye said that the order when you do say Shehechiyanu as well. So you have Kiddush to say, you have Havdalah to say. What's the order? And we're going to see opinions for many different ways to say this, the order of brachas when you have a Kiddush and Havdalah together. Yak zina. Yayin, you say Bar Priagafen, the bracha on the wine. Kiddush, regular Kiddush. Zman, you say Havdalah. Ner, you're going to say the bracha on the candle. Havdalah, and the hay is for Havdalah. You're going to say the bracha of separation, the Havdalah. Now, and the bracha for Havdalah changes. Normally, we say Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol, one who separates between the holy Shabbos and Chol and the mundane, the weekday. On Yantif, when it goes into Yantif, we're not going to say from holy to mundane because we're going into Shabbos. So we end the bracha Mavdil ben Kodesh L'kodesh. You separate between one holiness and another holiness. In any case, but you see that it's talking about even the beginning of Yantif because he's saying Zman, he's saying Shehechiyanu, and yet he's saying it all on 1 cup. V'Rava Amar, and Rava says it, Knahaz, which is our custom, Yaknahaz, that we say Yayin, Bar Priagafen, Kiddush, Ner, we say the bracha on the candle, Havdalah, we say the bracha on the separation between Shabbos and Yantif, Mavdil being Kodesh, L'Kodesh, who separates between one holiness and another, and Zman, and then we say Shehechiyanu. Either way, whether we say Abaya or Rava, we'll see there are other opinions as well. What's clear is it's talking about the beginning of Yantiv because he's saying Shehechiyanu, so he has plenty of wine for Yantiv, and yet he's saying all the brachas on 1. So how can you tell me the reason why, according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, he's going to say Kiddush on 1 cup and Havdalah on another cup, even though he could say it on 1? The reason why he's saying it on 2 is because you don't bundle mitzvahs because it looks like a burden. It looks like you're just trying to get it out of the way. It doesn't look like you're endearing and you're giving proper kavod for each one of the mitzvahs separately. But over here, you're saying Yain Kiddush Havdalah. You're all doing it in 1. So we see that you can't say it all together at 1. The Gemara says no. There's a reason for that. El Havdalah v'Kiddush Chadam Milsi, because Havdalah and Kiddush actually is one concept. It's the sanctification of the day and the recognition of its change to the next day. And in fact, as the Rashbam points out, in the Shabbos going into Yontif Havdalah, it actually mentions the sanctification of the next day as well. So really, even in the Havdalah, you're mentioning Kiddush, because you say Hamavdil ben Kodesh LeKodesh, who separates from one holiness to another, recognizing that they are both holy and they're just distinct in their holiness. So really, Kiddush, the sanctification of the day, saying it's Yontif, and we welcome Yontif with Kiddush, and the separation from Shabbos, and saying that Shabbos is a different Kedusha. The Havdalah, that separation, is really one concept. That's why you say it on one bracha. El Havdalah v'Kiddush Chadam Milsi. However, Birkas Hamazon v'Kiddush, the benching, which is a concept on a meal and a thanking Hashem for the food, and Kiddush, sanctification of the day, those are two different concepts. You can't say them on one cup because they are different concepts. Different concepts require different statements. Trei mili ninu, they are two and require a separate bracha for each one, a separate cup of wine. And the conclusion here is you're going to have two separate cups of wine, one for Kiddush and one for Havdalah, and the conclusion for Kiddush and two separate cups of wine, one for Kiddush and one for benching. However, the conclusion in regards to Havdalah, when coincides with Kiddush, like this year when Shabbos is going to go into the Seder, into Pesach, you're going to have both the Kiddush of the day and the Shechiyanu and the Bar Pri Hagafen together with the Havdalah and the Ner and the Bracha on the candle, and they're all going to be on the one cup because it's all one concept. The concept of the recognition of the sanctity of one day and its distinction from the next day. And in this case, you even mention the Kiddush in the distinction that you're making, the Havdalah that you're making. You mention the sanctity of Shabbos and the sanctity of the new day that you're sanctifying. So really, it's all one concept. You say it on one day. Tomorrow, Be'ez Hashem, we're going to see the differences of opinion of what order these brachas are said in. And they're based upon a few halachic concepts. One halacha is tadir v'she'eno tadir. When you have something that's a constant, that happens constantly, versus something that does not, you're always not always, but generally you're going to say the tadir, the constant, comes first. And then Kiddush versus separation, which one would come first. So we're going to see various opinions and explain each one of the opinions based on some halachic concept as to why these five brachos that come upon the day, you have the bracha on the wine for the Bar Pri Hagafen, you have the Kiddush for the day, you have the candle, which is part of Havdalah, the Havdalah itself, and the Shechiyanu. You have those five brachas. You have to say what's the order and why. As Hashem, we'll see that all tomorrow.